how are you?
Hello,
Sat Sri Akal to you. Are you all
Sasri
right?
Gal. I'm really well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. Very good to see you after. Well, it's been a few months, hasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it definitely has. Yeah, thanks for having me on this again. And I do apologize for the late response. I was just university started, everything crammed in. I saw your message and I was like, oh, I need to reply, and then I
Mhm.
completely lost it. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. So, 17 United Nations Sustainable Goals. So, in your education, have you been asked to discuss these? I know, like with your work in the cadets and everything, I
Mhm.
suppose it's quite relevant to that work as well, isn't it? So tell me first of all, what's your opinion about how we're tackling these goals as a as a country and globally as well.
I think so specifically to the 17 the UN sustainability goals, we did touch on them in a university module. Um, and actually we were critiquing them regarding, so this was a module we did last year in year three regarding the food, um, the free school meals, and the campaign that Marcus Rashford was quite instrumental in, and we're critiquing the government on the lack of intervention for it. So I'm quite familiar with it, but not too versed on it. But regarding, so everything that the 17 values that are presented, I think immediately when I saw them, I instantly thought of like sick values, especially like the first three. It's just like no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being. Especially zero hunger. I think we can all relate that to langar, because
Mm.
langar is inclusive. It's open to all. It's vegetarian, so it caters to all dietary needs and requirements.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
the quality of education actually hit me because I was reading a book about the Sikh Empire recently, and there's a British Orientalist. His name was Lyther, or his surname was Lyther. I forgot his first name was, but he was talking about how the quality of education had dramatically dropped in Punjab, and he was writing this in 1860s, and he was talking about how the Sikh Empire had an education system that was not that was outclassing the sort of European standard of system, and although nowadays we don't really have an empire or any sort of level of sovereignty, the quality of education does speak volumes from that sort of sense, especially in those times. Um, so that was one that kind of struck out to me most. And also good health and well-being, like the concept of like the warrior aspect of it, like training, the martial aspect, like Shastra Vidya, Gataka. Um, that's still it's not as prevalent, well, especially not in the UK. There's not many like Akade and many like Gataka classes, but it's definitely like an upward trend with a lot of youth coming into that sort of thing. And even myself, I take quite a big interest in like Shastra, like types of weapons, the material it's composed of, and just generally the lost art that we used to have. And yeah.
Yes, because when we talk about quality of education, very often we just think about qualifications. That's the natural tendency. It's like quality education. Well, get a good, when I was at school, my parents were asking me to get good qualifications so I could get a good job. So that's normally what we think about education, the formal education. It's like equipping us to have a better standard of living. But what you talk about, they are considered to be simply hobbies, things that you do in your free time that, that they're not going to earn you a living, they're not going to add to your wealth necessarily, but they would certainly add to your well-being. So when you were at school and you were leaving school, like when I was leaving school, my teachers were always encouraging me to say that, well, in my CV, I've got to list my interests, because if you don't list at least 3 good interests, then it is going to make your CV look as though you're not a well-rounded person. So some people could write that they were the captain of the football team, or like yourself, like your volunteer work with the cadets. And for me, it was photography and other hobbies that I was pursuing, like gardening and things like that. That kind of adds to who I am, not just simply like what my qualifications are, but who I am as a person. So do you think that we are doing enough as a community to, like, when we go to the Gurdwara, I know that in most Gurdwaras that are large enough, they have Punjabi classes, but do we have enough of this extra education, which will enhance our well-being?
Mhm. I think I think in certain areas, like for example, I know Birmingham, they have loads of classes, whether it be Shasta, even like Rag Kirtan, like the old school Puratan style of Kirtan with like the instruments that the gurus create, like the Dil Rubab. Um, but I think as a whole, speaking about the UK, I think there's a lot more we can do. Um, there's a great initiative started by the Sikh Education Council where they were creating Punjabi lessons for adults. And I think a lot of Punjabi lessons are catered towards children and that sort of demographic. And myself, like, because I've recently got a Sikhi, I can understand Punjabi, but speaking it is very broken.
Mm.
Um, but
Yeah.
like small initiatives like Punjabi classes for adults or even English classes for older people, like for like the older generation, like such as my mum, like her English is not too good, but they're setting something up like that as well. So these sort of classes, like all the like English classes, Punjabi classes, these are I think they're definitely there's I think there's more of a demand for it, and I think we could definitely do more as a community to sort of cater to those needs. But that's more like on a basic level. But in terms of like coming back to the 17 values that I was talking about, Shastra Vidya, like I think that's something I was recently introduced to more of, and I really like sort of fell in love with the concept of it because I was like, that's amazing. Like it's not just about the weapons, it's about the movement, it's about the body, it's about like the way you defend yourself in different circumstances. Like for example, if in battle your bug comes off, what do you do? Your case is everywhere, but there's maneuvers and there's different tactics you can do to continue fighting on the battlefield, right? Um, I think yeah, there's a lot more like we could do as a community in terms of obviously like Base of Sikhi is a great foundational platform in the sense that it's provided people with like it's opened people's eyes. Like Bhaji Guraj Singh Ji has like really revolutionized the way that people born in the UK see Sikhi, like including myself. Like it changed my life. Um, but I feel like more on a deeper, even like on a scholar, sort of like a scholar level in terms of how we can become like researchers within the Bant, like academically. Um, there's a great book actually. One my mentor recommended me this, but it's about jobs, but it's related to Christianity. So it talks about different fields of jobs like doctors, lawyers, dentists, but then it incorporates the Bible into it as well, like which job would be best for you, and quotes from the Bible to back that up, and kind of just give an all well-rounded thing. And I don't think we have that like in the Sikh community, like a book that's dedicated to like different vocations and with like Gurbani quotes to kind of back it up. Not like to reinforce it, like saying it's Gurmat, but in a sense that kind of just encourages the person to kind of pursue that thing
Mm.
more. But small little initiatives like that, I think we're behind
Mm.
in those things.
Well, this is like the younger generation yourself. These are the things that hopefully you will pursue. You will create those like ripple effects so that things get better and we have more resources available which are specific to our needs. Because the reason I started these conferences based on Sikhi values is because of the lack of resources. And you mentioned research, that we need to there are a couple of places, I believe, that Sikhism is being researched, a couple of places in England, but there needs to be a lot more. I would love, my dream is that every university would have Sikhi courses, every university, not just a couple. In London, I don't know how many universities have the discipline of like the Sikh studies, for example. I'm not sure.
There's so like in terms of actual university modules, like, I got Queen Mary's. I don't think there's a single one. But there is a Sikh studies course, which is a comprehensive course from Guru Nanak Dev Ji to 1984, and it talks about it in depth, and it's got like it's like academic referencing, and it's open Q&A as well. So as you're teaching, you can raise your hand and ask questions on the spot. And a lot of university students do go to that from like Sikh Soc. And I personally went to it in 2021, so last year, and they definitely got me more involved into history. So that's
An
definitely
online
that's
course, is it?
oh no, it's in person as well. It's on campus. It's
Oh,
at
I see.
different
At St.
London
Mary's.
universities. Not at Queen Mary's. It's at I think it's at UCL and King's.
Okay,
But
yes.
yeah.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So, but it needs to be interconnected. So it's not kind of like an isolated thing. And so that's very often the case. It's like we discover these things in isolation, random, and like when it becomes mainstream, and it will, with your generation taking the lead, all of these things will become mainstream because we have so much value to add to enable us to tackle these goals, which are not simply particular to any community. They're relevant to all of us, aren't they?
Yeah.
And when you talk about things like no poverty, zero hunger, for example. And we talk about the langar, and you said like it's vegetarian food, so it's good for everyone. But it's not always good for everyone though, because a lot of the langar, the Gra Prasad, has so much sugar and butter, and some people are in fact vegan now. They're vegan because for health reasons, for political reasons, and so do you think like we need to be thinking about the times now? Because like 500 years ago, making prasad with a lot of ghee and kheer with so much kind of sugar and jalebia and mithai, and 500 years ago, so back in time and back in space as well, like back in the Punjab, it's absolutely fine because people do a lot of hard work in the kid, and so they can burn off that sugar, so the diet is fine for the Punjab. But here in England or anywhere where we're not farming, we're not burning off all that, and we're suffering from diabetes and all kinds of things like that. Do you think that we've kept up with the times in terms of what we provide as food in the gurdwaras?
I think so. I'm not a dietitian, but I think with the I forgot his name. He was in the conference as well. He works for the NHS because he made a really good point when we had our last. I think it was maybe the second conference we had, but he talked about how the langar, like chips and beans and stuff, is not really healthy. And langar is supposed to, like, on the concept of well-being, like the food we eat is very like important for like our body and our mind. Um, but we still have that sort of traditional like roti, dal, sabji, which is the healthy. But then I understand like with the with the jalebia, with the mitha, like the sweets and stuff. And you're completely right with the lifestyle we used to live. We used to be like out physical. Nowadays we're quite like maybe like sedentary, maybe sitting at desk. Um, I think so. At home, what we did was my mom. So when my mom used to make jar, we used to put sugar in it, like white sugar. But what we started to do is now we've tried to put like shakkar, I think it's cane sugar.
Yeah.
So it's still a sweetener and it's still sweet, like, but it's got its added benefits. Like it's got like its it's got extra vitamins and minerals and whatnot. Um, I think in terms of Kara Prasad, I think because that's like a set Maryada set by the gurus, I think that personally I don't think it should be tampered with. I think it should remain. And even with kheer as well, because I think um Mata Kiwi, I think was like she was renowned for making her kheer and people loved it. And I think it's a good question, and I think it's something maybe I need to think about more. But I definitely agree the langar that they serve now isn't the best in terms of like nutritional value. Like the traditional roti, dal sabji, that's fine. But I think the other stuff like chips, beans, yeah, that sort of stuff, maybe we need to think about it. And I think like a one-off sort of thing is fine. Like, but if it's consistent, like we're gonna have chips and beans like every week, for like 4 days a week because we're not getting cooks or something.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think that's definitely a conversation we should probably develop on.
Yeah, and when we think about beans, for example, they have so many preservatives, and
Oh
so
yeah.
we don't read the labels necessarily. And milk, for example, we use a lot of milk in the gurdwaras, and some of that milk could come from like places where it's not organic,
Mm.
it's not free range. The cows that are being used for that milk, they're kept in very bad conditions because we don't know where the milk comes from. Like people will buy the milk. They might buy the milk in a place where we don't know where they've bought it. We don't know where it's actually come from, and so in terms of Girt Kamal, we don't know
Mm.
where all the dairy product, even the butter and whatever, we don't know where it comes from. And so in terms of ethics, do we, when we're partaking of langar, how ethical is it if the food that we have been served has come from sources that are unethical?
Mm. I think the the question, it could be twofold, because one, us Sikhs, we have the responsibility of Sarvat Tapala, so we want to feed the people that need food, like especially like in today's like economic climate with the cost of living. So we could decide not to do that and try and do like everything organic, but because it's so expensive to buy organic, how are we going to be able to serve the people that need it most? But also, I think a solution that's simple but not so simple is to, like, if we had our own sort of like Khalsa farms, like each like mainstream Gurdwara had like a bunch of cows, horses, and whatnot, and then we could do it ourselves. But in that way, we get to connect with nature, just as like Guru Harai Sabji used to, and then also we get like the aspect of like the like you can even do horse riding. Well, like, there's a lot. The possibilities of it is endless. You can do meditation outside. You can go see the animals. People can connect with nature more. And again, these are just ideas, but in
Yeah,
terms of implementation, it's gonna.
mentioned that dream to you before. I know I've mentioned that dream to you before about the horses and everything. And so
Yeah.
hopefully one day soon we will be able to manifest that kind of environment where the Gurdwara, like you say, it's not just a building that you go indoors but everything surrounding that, the Gurdwara, there's nature, there's gardening, we could have our own horticultural beds where we grow our own gobi, and that's part of the education.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a Gurdwara where they teach gardening, for example. Wouldn't that be nice?
That would be great. Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh no, I thought I think that's a great initiative. I think especially so like my grandparents are really good at gardening because obviously they were farmers back in the day. But I I don't know anything about gardening. All I used to do is water the plants. I worked in a garden center for 2 years as well. I know a bit about soils, different types, but I don't know how do you know if it's ripe? How much water does it need? When's the best time to water? That sort of stuff. But I think again, like that can be like a all-rounded class for like children, teenagers, young adults, adults. Yeah, that's gardening is definitely a skill that I need to learn.
Yeah, there's gardening and all sorts of other skills, because again, like in the past we used to make our own clothes, we used to knit our own cardigans and pullovers and whatever, and so that's also relevant because in terms of sustainability, so many of us we buy clothes and then we throw them away, whereas if we'd knitted something ourselves we would probably wear it for a lot longer than a cardigan that we bought in Primark and it's kind of ruined after 2 washes, and then you think, oh, can't wear that anymore. And so we used to have situations where the women, for example, would get together and over a cup of tea, and they would bring their knitting needles and they would be knitting. We don't see that kind of community togetherness that is important for well-being. And the men would get together and talk about, they would be talking about how to expand things, like at the Gurdwara and things like that. Maybe like there's well, obviously there is the Gurdwara committee that sit down and talk, but not the wider community as a whole. And have you noticed this kind of lack of, maybe like perhaps because you're quite young and I'm a lot older, so I'm kind of comparing the way things are now compared with the way things were back in the 60s, you see.
Yeah.
Back in the 60s, people used to just gather in their living rooms a lot more. You didn't have to phone people, to just turn up. And that's, so in terms of our well-being and our sense of like connectedness rather than isolation, what do you think, how well do you think we're doing in that?
In terms of the good water, or just like as a
community? Yes.
It's a good question. I think from my point of view, coming to Siki quite recently, I think it's okay, but it definitely could be better in terms of, so we have like Sangat and groups and stuff. We have the classes, but then I think, so this is relating to the Gurdwara actually. And the reason I say it is because Southall Gurdwara, which is quite my local Gurdwara, it recently had elections and a new party came in and stuff, and they're pulling like really good ideas and initiatives, and they're a mixture of like the youth and the older generation. So it's a mixture of both mindsets. So the older generation have the experience, the youth have this sort of fresh new perspective, and they're really working together now to kind of build like initiatives. And it's you can definitely see through. Like it's only been like a couple of weeks, I think 2-3 weeks actually, and you can already see all these posters and flyers and leaflets and stuff coming out for different groups. Like a small thing I saw yesterday was a morning coffee session. Like it's just a general like a coffee and chat. I don't know, it's called a jar and chat, but it's coffee and chat. Um, but like small little things like that, especially because it's aimed towards the older generation, because they suffer the most in terms of isolation. Because like us youth, we're just on our phones all day, so we're okay. But like there's something I kind of encourage my grandparents to go to. I was like, it's good for you guys because they just kind of stuck at home. Yeah, they go for walks and stuff, but I think it'd be nice for them to kind of meet new Sangat and just talk to people and just kind of vibe really in a good way of saying.
And you
Yeah.
talk about the younger generation being more involved now in those committees. And thinking about the lifestyles, our lifestyles have changed dramatically compared with, the older generation, and now well, I'm not sure if there is any more acceptance of people whose lifestyles are are not fitting the norm. For example, LGBT, homosexuality and things like that. In the past, those things were never discussed, but we can't ignore the fact that, some people are homosexual and they want to be accepted as homosexual. How do they fit in with the Gurdwara kind of community?
I think from like a Sikh point of view, I'm not even sure if there's a consensus on this. Like, what has like the Akal Takht or like the Sikh authorities said about this sort of stuff? As far as I'm concerned, the lens I kind of take of it is like the lens of inclusivity. So, I mean, if somebody is part of the LGBT community, they can still come to the Gurdwara and have langar and partake in seva, I think. And we shouldn't treat them any differently because of the sexuality. I think we're still human, just as we treat like an animal with respect, because everybody has the jot of Vaheguru. Um, so I think, again, I think these are one of the many discussions that like the GOM have to have like as a whole. And it's something obviously like as you mentioned, like times are changing massively. Like something like that's been going on for like a while is like the so we have Gurbani on our phones now. So how do we show like proper satkar to it? Do we have like a device specifically just for Gurbani, or do we use our normal phones? But our normal phones, we take it all like everywhere, like work, commuting, and it's just what I mean. And there's no consensus on like these sort of things. I think it does create confusion, but I think the lens we could take is just kind of be tolerant of everybody.
Yeah, and and I suppose it's the younger generation that we've been educated in a different way to be a lot more open-minded about things compared with the older generation. It's like some things are just taboo. I suppose that's what it is. It's like we don't see these things as taboo anymore because we've been brought up in a very different way. And so that goes back to the education as well. Are we educating ourselves in a way that we're willing to be critically self-reflective? We're willing to challenge the status quo, because again, it's like in some communities, this is the way things are, and you can't challenge, you can't question why things are done in a particular way. For example, I know somebody got into a lot of trouble because they questioned some things that were written in the Gurbani about Guru Nanak Dev Ji's death, for example. They questioned the fact that, well, some people say that under the sheet, all they found was flowers. How was that possible? And just simply in questioning that incident, they got into a lot of trouble. And whereas the younger generation, it's like, for me, it's like, well, if there's something that we are confused about, something that we don't understand, it's perfectly acceptable to question it, and that's not disrespectful to question what we don't understand.
Yeah, again, I think it's more like a generational thing. It's like, so when my granddad used to tell my dad to do something, he would just do it. But then when my dad tells me to do something, I'd be like, why? Like, is there a reason? And I think, like, when I came to Sikhi, I really not critiqued it, but I asked a lot of questions. Like, why do we do this? Why is it this way? Why this? Why that? Why that? And then I think from the questioning again, it's like, because Sikhi was kind of not forced onto me. It was more or less like me kind of learning and being like, wow, this is really amazing. And because the questions I asked, and I think this is just like in general life, if you keep asking questions, you start to understand things more. But also it's good for in terms of like growing your mindset as well, and in terms of educating others. So if like a non-Sikh asks me a question, I would know the why. So if they say, why'd you keep your hair? I'd be like, oh, because the guru said so. But they'd be like, why? What's the significance? And I can give them an explanation, and they could be like, oh, okay, they can understand it more. Otherwise, it just kind of looks forced upon.
Yeah. And like a lot of our knowledge is inherent, it's intrinsic to us. It's not something that we learn in a formal setting. And so there's a lot of things that we do things in particular ways and we haven't questioned them ourselves. It's just instinctual in a way. So it's as though it's coded in our DNA, the way we do things in particular ways, because through generations, that's the way it's been done, and it's there, it's written in our DNA. And in the formal education, we don't always draw on this intrinsic, instinctual, innate knowledge. And so for you, how do you kind of like balance like what you know through your own inherent kind of self, the awareness, and what you are, what's being tapped into from the external environment?
Yeah, literally as you said that, I thought of science and religion. I don't know why, but it came to my mind. And in terms of Sikhi and science, I see a lot of links between Sikhi and science. Like some religions, science might say one thing and then religion says another thing, and it's like, well, there's a bit of a paradox there. But with Sikhi and science, like I see a lot of correlations in terms of like even just the way the world was created, like energy. What else is it? Like there's loads. I can't think on the top of my head right now, but there's loads of other things that like we talk about the external side. I see that as like the science, and then the internal, the innate is like Sikhi. And then when you bring them together, that's when it starts to make sense. And when you start to ask the questions as well, that's when it just kind of like cements it. But yeah, I think.
Do you think that that's maybe one of the reasons why there's a lot of similarities between what we believe as through Sikhi and the Western education, that we find it very easy for us to adapt because we have that scientific inherent belief, that we change and we adapt based on our environment, which is, like the scientific approach, isn't it?
I think for like myself, when I listen to Gurbani, there's some things I understand and some things I don't, because like my understanding of like Punjabi, and we talk about like the Sharda and the Guru, and I think that's an important thing. But I think for some people it might be the case that okay, I believe the Guru is the Guru, but I can't, like with the Bani, they don't really understand it and stuff. So I think that external, like when I talk about science, that's just like that's like supplementing what the Guru is saying. Like that's how I kind of see it.
Yeah, because when I think about like the 500 years from Guru Nanak Dev Ji's times, and like his life and the context in which he was alive was very different compared with the times of Guru Gobind Singh Ji. The times had changed, and so their behavior was very different. Guru Nanak Dev Ji's behavior, he was challenging in a very different way compared with the way Guru Gobind Singh Ji had to challenge. And I think one of the important things is that we have to remember that the gurus defended themselves, but they never attacked, right? And that's a very fundamental difference between cultures that are expansionist, cultures that say, let's kind of expand and take over. We've never, as a Qom, we've never wanted to take over what was not ours, but we've always defended, haven't we?
Yeah.
The focus has been on defending. And I suppose what I'm trying to say there is that we live in very different times compared with Guru Nanak Dev Ji. Look at we're having this conversation, we're not even physically present with each other. And that wasn't possible 500 years ago. So times have changed. And so even though there's all that knowledge which is in our DNA, and we can express all that knowledge that has been kind of stored in our DNA, and at the same time, we have to respond differently to the new environment because we're responding to the environment which didn't exist 500 years ago.
Right. I see that, yeah. No, definitely. I think we talk about different circumstances, like even like generationally, like when the first generation came to the UK, like my grandparents, like how different their lives, like the way they were living was to the current, like our generation now. Like not just like technology, but also the level of freedom they have to practice their religion, the level of racism that they may have faced and discrimination. And just, yeah, I mean, like a lot has changed in the past 60, 70 years alone, let alone 500 years back in Guru Nanak Dev Ji's time. So
the
yeah.
challenge for us is to apply that knowledge, isn't it? Because I mean, in my work, I work with senior leaders, and we teach management and leadership theory, but it's all very well to to acquire that knowledge about management and leadership theory. The real learning is when they apply that knowledge to their organizations. It's the same with us. We have the Sikhi knowledge and we have the values, but that's fine, by itself, but we have to apply it. We have to find, well, how does this relate to us, and how do we use that knowledge in the environment that we're currently in, which is totally new, which we're faced with challenges that we didn't have before, the economical challenges and the challenges to do with health, for example. We have the possibilities nowadays to transplant organs or receive organ donations, and all of that didn't happen 300 years ago. So we have decisions to make about, well, what do we think about that? Is it okay for me to accept someone else's heart into my own body? Is that God's will? If my heart fails, would I be willing to take, to have a heart donor, for example, or a kidney, or, whatever? How does that fit in with divine will? What do we think about it? And if we think, yes, it's okay, then are we doing enough to donate our own organs? Are we doing enough to say, like, well, have I written it in my will that, my organs will be donated on death, for example? Have I made that decision? Because we can't accept without being willing to give as well, right?
Yeah. I think these are conversations, again, like a wider sort of Bantic consensus, because a lot of these, I think they're very personal questions, but in terms of what does Sikhi say about them, I mean, I've personally haven't researched much into it. There might be even like a statement, but I'm not too sure myself. But just, sorry, a question to you. So you mentioned that you were like around senior leaders and stuff. In terms of, because I think a couple of the things that we said now is about reaching a consensus within the community. How do you think as a Sikh community we can go about doing that?
Well, I don't think it's possible to reach a consensus, because we always have to know the context, because what is right in one context won't be right in another context. And so we have to be careful about taking on kind of consensus decisions that have been made in Amritsar, because they might be fine in Amritsar, but they're not fine in Birmingham, because the context is very, very different. And so I think that it has to be contextualized, and decisions have to be made at the personal and the local level before it goes beyond that. What do you think?
I think context is very important, but I think having some sort of like framework to which the context can be sort of expanded on. So having like, not like a set, that's a good question. Not like, because if it's like a yes or a no, then it might be like, but this is the situation.
I'll
Do
give you
we?
an example, Arvinda. I'll give you an example of like what I was thinking of when I said that. For
Sure.
example, I think it was about 20 years ago, but I'm not, I think it was in the 90s when the committee in Amritsar, for some reason, they decided that in the Gurdwaras, we can't have any tables. And they went around the world and they started kind of like knocking out tables of, so like langar can't be, you have to sit on the floor. But they didn't take into account that some people are disabled. They can't sit on the floor. Some people have arthritis. They can't sit on the floor. Pregnant women can't sit on the floor easily. And so we're more sensitive about the needs of, living in the West. We tend to be a lot more sensitive of the needs of those who are disabled and whatever. And so now we have, like in Southall, there's a choice. You can stand and have your langar, or you can sit on the floor, and there are a few tables for those who are disabled. But that's an example of a decision, of a very fundamentalist kind of decision made by a committee somewhere, in Amritsar, that was totally disconnected with what the needs were of local communities around the world.
Right.
So
I understand, yeah, because that's why like context plays a big factor. I don't think, I mean, I'm not too sure about that case, but like, did they take some like opinions of the community? Like, did they ask the Bunts in terms of what their views on it were, or did they just implement it straight away, sort of thing?
they were going around. There was like violence in some gurdwaras in Canada, where these people were, and again, it's like, Sikhi is meant to be about compassion and empathy, and sometimes people can get so powerful in their own minds that they think that they have the power to force their will on others, and that's what was happening. And so I do remember reading about violence in gurdwaras in Canada, where these people were, you know, going in their little gangs. You know, I have to call them gangs because that's what you call people who are imposing their will on others forcefully. And Sikhi is not meant to be about forceful imposition of our will, you know, on the others. And they were just basically knocking tables around, you know, and saying, you got to get rid of these tables. And you know, I haven't been to Canada for a long time, so I don't know how long that kind of lasted. But I know here in England, we like, I live in Birmingham now, and in Birmingham at the Smethwick Gurdwara, you can sit on the floor or you can sit on tables. You know, it's a choice. And I think that's what we need to give people. It's like choices, so that we don't impose our own will and say, this is what you've got to do. And I think, you know, like back in the 80s, there was a lot of fundamentalism where they were going around harassing women who didn't cover their hair, for example, or they didn't have their hair tied in plaits, for example. I mean, you know, it's I think a woman has the right to decide for herself how she wears her hair. You know, we can't impose that on others.
Yeah, I think it's coming from a place of compassion. Like that's like Guru Nanak's fundamental like first teaching was pyar, love. And I think, yeah, if you impose it like in a really rush, like in a just a rush way, it just comes across like, not only does it paint a picture of like, because ultimately, if you were at the start, you're like ambassador to Sikhi, like whether you like it or not, like if you go on the streets, people are gonna think, oh, you know, if I start screaming like a lunatic, they're gonna think, what are these Sikhs doing? But yeah, it's just about coming from.
Yeah, because it goes back to that thing earlier where I was saying that Guru Gobind Singh Ji defended, never attacked. But these people who were claiming to be Sikhs, you know, to attack a woman because she hasn't plaited her hair, that's an attack. That's not defense. So then we know it's wrong. It's wrong because, you know, you're on the wrong side of truth, basically, because we're meant to be defending, not attacking.
Yeah.
And kind of like going around gurdwaras and saying you can't sit on tables, that's an attack. It's not a defense of anything. What is it a defense of, you know?
Yeah.
And so that leads to this thing about peace and justice. And, you know, so when we talk about peace and harmony and justice, and how can we advocate for justice without taking away other people's rights?
I think the Gurus really did that really well. I mean, Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj, he did exactly that in terms of upholding the rights of other people, even non-Sikhs, and considering the circumstances the Sikhs were faced with against the Mughals, the way they were isolated and they're persecuted, and following from that, like the Miso period, in the sense that Baba Deep Singh saved the women from the from the Pathans, from the Afghans. But then I think about modern times, like how are we kind of helping them now? I think there's like local groups in terms of like grooming, like the Sikh Youth UK on a sort of micro scale, but I don't think we're at the level we used to be. But then again, it comes back to like, how are we as a Qom? Like I think we're in a state of like suppression because we don't really have much sovereignty. People kind of see us like Sikhs as these good people, free food and sort of stuff. They don't see the deeper meaning of what Sikhi is about. I think like from a holistic lens. So how can we maintain peace? I think obviously like the Sikhi is about pyar and compassion, but I think definitely a lot more could be done. And in terms of what could be done, I think that's like a whole other session itself. But I think, yeah, I'm just lost for words.
Well, partnerships, for example, you know, like the work that you do with the cadets, for example, in a way, that's one of the partnerships, isn't it? So it's like you can talk about your Sikhi with that, and yet it's quite a distinct value system, isn't it? And there are a lot of similarities. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of common ground in terms of the values, because values are universal. You know, values are universal, but we prioritize some values over others.
Yeah. But I think the concept of peace and stuff, like you see all these like protests, like regarding like maybe it's human rights or like violation of like land rights or whatever. And there's always Sikhs. So you always see Sikh figures there, like with the stars. They got like the leaflets. No, so they got the posters and whatnot. Um, like they are actively engaging in politics, but I think are they, I think we need to be actively engaging in internal like politics that affects us. Because when I get to see like Sikh protests and stuff regarding whether it be like farmers, actually the farmers was really not, because I saw quite a lot of people there. But in terms of like things like the 1984 rallies in June and stuff, and most of them, like about 95% are Sikh. Like I don't see any other groups coming out. Whereas like if there's another issue, you see loads of Sikhs going out to help them. So
Mm.
again, I mean, it could come down to partnerships as well. But yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because it tends to be very kind of we're very insular about those things, which means that we've only spoken about those things amongst ourselves. We haven't spoken about those things like 1984. We haven't spoken about those to other groups, you know. So let's say people might be involved with Amnesty International, and so they may be very interested and very kind of like they have a lot of empathy for the injustice that has gone on against the Sikhs there, but we don't. It's as though we're only talking about it amongst ourselves at the moment. So how can we build these bridges so that we are, you know, that message is being broadcast, perhaps like not in a very kind of you know, aggressive way, but broadcast in a way that it does educate other people to take an interest in who we are and what we're suffering from. I noticed that done very well in a book that I read recently called The Light We Bring by, have you heard of it?
No.
I'm just trying to look on my
it.
shelves where it is. I think it's called The Light We Bring, and it's written by someone called Simranjit, I think, who lives in Texas, or certainly he was brought up in Texas. And he's done it very well because he's talked about his own experiences of overcoming racism in Texas and the US. But in that, he's referred on several occasions, he's referred to the 1984 you know, the tragedies there. He's referred to it. And so so someone who is interested, it's like, so in telling our own story, when we make reference to these other things that have really hurt us as a community, that's one way of you know, raising awareness of these issues, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, who's that? What's that book called?
It's called The Light We Bring. Yeah, here it is. Oh, it's called The Light We Give. Yeah.
Light We Give. Oh, okay. Oh yes. Oh, I think I saw it on LinkedIn actually.
Yes.
Right.
He's on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
and it's his name is Simranjit Singh. Yes, I found it.
Sweet.
It's a very good book, and as I say, it's you know, apart from the fact that his own story is interesting, I was very interested in how he wove in the experiences and wove in, you know, the fact that so many Sikhs have had to leave the Punjab because they are no longer safe there.
Yep.
So we're not safe in our own country. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
And another thing which is interesting, when we talk about justice, when we talk about representation, we're going through a very interesting period in our lives here in the UK right now, like with Rishi Sunak being, you know, he lost to Liz Truss. Why did he lose? Did he lose because of racism? Did he lose because the Conservative Party members couldn't bear to see somebody who is not white representing them? So that's related to the peace and justice. It's like he was born in England. He was born in England, and yet because of the color of his skin and his name, he's not seen to be British enough to be. He's fine as a chancellor, but not fine as a prime minister. So, and that, you were born in England. And so, what about, like, say, in 20 years' time, if you were to run for that elevated leadership position, do you think that you might face similar issues, that even though you are the most competent person, by far, you're the most competent, but simply because of your image, the color of your skin and how you dress and the name that you go by, you're not seen to be represented? So who is it that we represent, and who do we want to be representing, and who would believe that in our credibility to represent them?
I think there's definitely going to be some aspect of like subconscious like bias in terms of someone's manifesto could be like fantastic, the competency could be great, but ultimately like if the way they look, the way they dress, like it doesn't match like what most people do, as in like the majority of the country, they might be like, yeah, no, it's all good, but they're gonna kind of have that sort of thing in the back of the mind, like let's have someone that's similar to us in the way they look become in power. Like I think I've got is it Kwasi, the chancellor that was recently sacked?
Yeah.
Like he was sacked on on such a whim, like so quickly. Fair enough, like his his budget wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but he like if it had been like again this is up for like a debate, but if he had been a different color, if he wasn't black, maybe would it have been like would have kept him on for a bit longer, or because it just everything just happened really quickly. Like he got sacked, and then the home secretary got she resigned, and then the prime minister resigned. It's like everything just happening all in one. Um, but no, I think there is. I think there also. I think there will always be like some sort of element of subconscious bias, unfortunately. But I think how do we go about dealing with that? I'm not too sure.
Yeah, but these are the questions,
Yeah.
because you have your whole career ahead of you, and so it's about positioning ourselves. It's like, do we position ourselves? Who is it that we want to be leading? And it's like, to lead, you have to really care about the people that you're leading, because otherwise people are not going to follow you if you seem that you don't care. And I think that some people believe that Boris Johnson, for some reason, cares about the country more than Rishi Sunak does, simply because Boris Johnson looks like them. So they feel that he cares about the country more than, someone who doesn't look like them does. So that's an interesting thing. And it is related to the Sustainable Development Goals, because it's to do with equalities at that highest level. We've already seen that, regardless of the level of competence, regardless of the, where people are born, and, regardless of that, there are inequalities that still exist. And, regardless of the amount of wealth somebody has, they can't overcome those inequalities, because Rishi Sunak is a very wealthy man. Being wealthy, being competent, being experienced, he's an experienced politician. None of those things overcome that unconscious bias that people have in, like, well, he doesn't look like us, so he's not going to represent us.
Yep.
So in terms, and this is why what I find at universities, we're talking about research. Earlier you said, like, we need to be doing more research, related to Sikhi, for example. What I notice is that in my lived experience, what I see is that people will get funding for their research if they are researching something to do with, like, say, equality. Like people like ourselves, will get funded if we want to do research in equality and diversity and things like that, things which are seen to be like, somebody who is not white will probably be good at that. But it's very difficult to get funding for the mainstream things, like, say, for example, psychology or creativity or innovation, things like that. That then our ethnicity doesn't. It seems to kind of like be a barrier. Like there's always someone else who's more suited to doing that. Whereas, so when I go to universities, several universities, and I've seen that those people who are Asian or who are Black, they tend to be researching things which are like they're put in a box. In this box, it's like, well, you can research about equality, but there's something to be disrupted in that as well, isn't there? That we, just because we're living in a society where we may be a minority, that doesn't mean to say that we need to be restricted to only studying minority issues.
I think again, it could be because it's just like sort of tokening, where it's like we want research on EDI or something. Let's get like a brown or black person to do it. That way, it looks like we're making effort because we're hitting two stones in one. So we're getting the research done and we're getting representation from them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And very often when you ask to look at the like the EDI figures, they will say, oh, we're doing quite well because we've got like 80% of our staff are from minority backgrounds. And when you analyze it, you'll see that, well, most of that 80%, they are like cleaners or, admin workers, or, they're not researchers. And they kind of, you see, so this is like when we're talking about goals, that in order to see how well we're meeting the goals, we need to have the data. We need to have some evidence of like how much progress we're making. And because without that data, without that evidence, we might kind of be under the impression that we're making a lot of progress when actually, in fact, we're not. And so when you go to universities and you look at their the comprehensive data, it needs to be analyzed and broken down to see, well, what's really happening, and then it's when those figures are broken down, that's when you, for example, as an educator, I know that in breaking down data, I know that Pakistani men, for example, they're more disadvantaged. Black men are very disadvantaged, but some communities, some minority communities are doing okay compared with them. But if we didn't kind of break it down, we wouldn't know Bangladeshi people are more disproportionately disadvantaged as well. We wouldn't know that until we break things down and analyze. And you being a student yourself now, it's like, I suppose you're being trained to be critical of the data that you're being presented with, so that you learn to look at, well, what's missing here? Like, don't just look at like how Black people are doing, because what do you mean by Black? Somebody from Nigeria may be doing a lot better than somebody from Jamaica, but if you call them both Black, you're not going to notice that. You're not going to notice the inequalities.
And it's also about raising the awareness as well. Like you mentioned at university, like they teach us the analytical things, but also I think from a work point of view, they teach us to sort of not challenge it, but to be aware of it. Like even when recruiting and stuff, like because we did I was shadowing a recruitment session, and they even had it on paper. Like, don't look at this, like don't they literally wrote it, not in caps, but it was like implied, like look for the qualities that we're trying to look for in terms of the specification for the job, rather than, ethnicity, the accent, or whatever.
Yes, but again, it's like again, the questions that can be asked, and I've been at interviews where I haven't thought that the process was very fair, because they might say, oh, we ask everyone the same questions. Well, yes, you do ask everyone the same questions, but you may not make eye contact equally with everyone. You may decide to write down, because they're taking notes, but you might decide to take more notes for one person compared with another. So there's still inequalities going on. You see, so this is kind of like there's inequalities at the level of assessments, that because when you have criteria which are very subjective, one person's, I'm a professional, and another professional may form a very different judgment about something you've said, even though we've both heard you saying the same thing, but that the other professional is basing their judgment about what you said based on their own experiences, their own values, their own priorities, and likewise myself. And so you can't say one person is right and the other one is wrong, because if you're relying on subjective judgments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You see, because one of my students, he I taught him in London, and when he was at university, you know, you have anonymous marking at universities. Do you have anonymous marking?
Yep.
Yeah. So most universities have anonymous marking. Why do we have anonymous marking? Because we know that without, you know, like if you have the names and whatever, that does have an unconscious kind of influence on what you think of it. That's the reason for the anonymous marking, is to try and overcome some of that subjectivity. But I remember this student of mine, he was at a different, he'd kind of graduated from my course and he'd gone on to university. And I remember, I still remember this. He said this probably about more than 10 years ago, but I still remember he said, it was just on, he was connected with me on Facebook, and he wrote a message to say, oh, even though there's anonymous marking, they know who you are, you know? And so that comment, it was like, you know, I could feel that he was feeling that injustice. You know, this student was from Somalia. He's from Somalia. So he was feeling that injustice, despite the fact that they said they were claiming it was anonymous marking. It's like, well, no, they still know who it is, you know? And
Yeah.
so what is it, you know, what do we do to overcome these subtle inequalities that occur? You know, the way work is marked, the way people are recruited, the way people are elected to represent as our prime minister. It's like, even at that level, we're still faced with the same kind of structural inequalities. How do we, what do we do to kind of chip away to create the justice that our gurus taught us to advocate?
I think from a Sikh point of view, is to do Simran and read Gurbani. I think I feel like it's always just going to be there in the back of the mind. I think because it's just so ingrained, especially like in Indian culture as well, like the way we look at things. Oh, it's a bit of a diversion to Sikhi, but it's just like we always have this sort of like in India. There's like a whole academic, can't even say the word, but it's just like a lot of people they ultimately people say like looks matters, right? And just you by your appearance people can see like, oh, are you the way you're dressed, the way like, you know, comb your beard and stuff, like, are you scruffy, are you professional? People judge that, and that builds their first impressions. And I think it's something like your first impressions are made within the first 20 seconds. I know that 20 seconds probably predominantly it's just like your appearance, the way you approach and the handshake and what you say and stuff. And because like, even with these like politicians and stuff, it's not like we're going to personally meet them, and I'm not going to get to meet Rishi Sunak and be like, yo, what's up, what's your ideas, and get to know him and be like, oh, he's a good guy. Because in a general election that's not going to happen, because we're voting based on the way he sounds, the way he speaks, the way he looks, and also his manifesto. But that's like his manifesto is probably like not, I wouldn't say it's like I'll say it's top three, but it's definitely not the first or the first on people's list in terms of what they'll do, let's say the way they'll vote. And so there's always going to be like that sort of underlying subconscious thing in the mind that's saying we want to vote for someone that's more similar to us, because again I think it's because we're kind of scared of change. We're like, what could happen if this person comes in? Like, who knows, maybe we're never going to see a white prime minister after this, you know? And people in a way fear that as well, I think.
Yeah. And that is a very sorry state of affairs, where we're, you know, where you say like the manifesto is probably number 3. You know, that should be top of the list. We should be voting for the policies. We should be voting for the values, not for the race, not for the, you know, not for a person's race, right?
Yep.
So, okay, there's a lot of work to be done. So,
Yep, 100%.
Thank you very much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure speaking with you once again. Very inspirational, thought-provoking, and